Hello Canada, my name is Alister Chapman and I'm here just outside of London in the United Kingdom at Sony's Pinewood Studios facility, and in this video I'm going to go through the version 3 firmware update for the FX9. Now the FX9, as we already know, is a great all-round camera. I've had one now for a couple of years and it really is my go-to camera for a lot of really important reasons. It's very good as a news and documentary camera. It's also very good as a filmmaking camera. But the new features in version 3 really expand that role even further, including making it much more suitable for studio applications. So the first thing that I'm going to look at in this video is the introduction of the ability to control the camera over Ethernet from an RCP remote control. So here we have a standard 3500 RCP, and if I have the lens in the A position, and this particular lens, a 28 to 135 in the auto position, you'll then find that I can control the aperture of the camera from the RCP. I can then also dial in my white balance remotely from the RCP. So I have a great deal of control over the camera from the RCP. Let's find a nice sensible white balance, there we go. I can change the gain of the camera in 3 dB steps. And I can also bring in the ND filter, should I want to, from the RCP. So I have a great deal of control. I can change the RGB levels, detail settings, and quite a lot from the RCP. So this ability to control the camera from an RCP means that the camera is now much more suited to studio applications, to outside broadcast and live applications. So it really does expand the functionality and the capabilities of the camera. So the next thing that I want to show you is what if we want to use a more traditional ENG lens. So if you're doing that live outside broadcast type shoot, you might want a more traditional zoom lens on the camera. So if I just go around the camera here, I'm going to change this lens and I'm going to fit the Sony LA EB1 to the camera. So this is a lens adapter for 2/3 inch lenses. This has to be powered from the XDCA FX9 or another DC power source. And then I can put a normal ENG lens on the camera. This then plugs into the LA EB1 like that. And now we have an ordinary zoom lens, and if we look at the output from the camera, oh dear, we have a problem. Look at that. It looks like I'm looking down a tube, and that's because I have the wrong scan mode. So this is currently set to full frame 6K scan, but what I really want now is to use another of the features of version 3 firmware, which is the Super 16 2K scan. Now, something that's been added as well in addition is the ability to assign that switching of scan modes, or switching of crop modes as Sony refer to it, to an assignable button. If I go into the camera menu and we go to our project settings, and in project settings we have our assignable button functions, and you can see that I've already set this to assignable button number 2 on this camera, crop select. So one of the limitations of this is if we're recording in UHD or 4K, pressing the button will only step through full frame 6K, full frame crop 5K, and S35 4K. And that's because these, to record in 4K or UHD, you've got to be using these scan modes. But if I now change the camera's recording codec to 1920 by 1080, so we're now shooting in HD, when I press the button I now get an additional scan mode, which is Super 16 2K, and now it no longer looks like we're shooting down a telescope tube because this matches the lens that I'm using. So now we have all those wonderful features, and in particular a huge zoom range, and I can zoom in and out very quickly or very slowly using this mode. So again, this expands the versatility of the camera. And something to be aware of with this mode that is also beneficial is that as well as getting a 2K Super 16 crop mode raw output up to 180 frames per second, because the 2K Super 16 crop mode doesn't skip any pixels, doesn't miss anything out in the way the sensor is read, the image quality when you're shooting above 60 frames per second is better in this mode than it is in the full frame 2K scan or the Super 35 2K scan. So for shooting high speed, if you want to shoot 120 or even up to 180 frames per second with the FX9, my recommendation is where you can to use the new 2K Super 16 crop mode. Now it does mean that your lens will become quite narrow, so if you're not using an ENG lens like this, if you're using a full frame lens, you will need a very wide lens to get a wide shot, but the image quality is going to be much improved using this mode for your slow motion. Right now the camera is in the AF face priority mode. We can see at the top of the screen it says AF and there's a little symbol showing a head and that the distance is 1.6 meters. But I now have the ability simply by touching on the screen. So all I'm going to do is touch on the picture on the shelf just below the head of the mannequin, and just by touching there the focus immediately changes. So the only thing I'm doing is touching the screen, and by touching the screen I can change precisely where the camera is focused. It's very, very easy, very, very quick. If I want to focus on the face, just touch on the face and the camera goes to it. If I want to focus on the picture in the background, just touch and the camera goes there. If I want to touch on the Campbell's chart, just touch and the camera goes there. It's really simple, really easy to use. Now in terms of movement, so if I touch on that picture at the top of the image and if that was moving or if I'm panning, the camera will follow that. There is a little bit of lag in the box updating on the display, but the autofocus you can see is remaining on that picture. And I could actually do a pull focus mid-shot like that. How about that? Trying to do something like that yourself is actually quite difficult. So this is a really significant update for this camera, and this is a very, very nice feature to have. Now the next thing a lot of people are interested in is the anamorphic mode that's coming. So this is a 1.33 times anamorphic setup. And if we look at the image now, you'll see that the face is distorted vertically. When I engage the new anamorphic mode, nothing will change on the SDI or HDMI output. This only affects what you see on the LCD screen. Now if I go to the camera menu and we now go to the monitoring settings and I go to the VF setting here, you'll see that there is now a de-squeeze option. And if we look at what happens on the LCD screen, when I go to 1.3 times, you'll just see that the image is squeezed that way, because a 1.3 times anamorphic lens is designed to work with a widescreen 16:9 imager. So this is all we need to do for 1.3 times. Now if we want to use 2 times anamorphic, if you watch the LCD screen carefully, you'll see that it's going to be squeezed that way, and it's also going to be squeezed and slightly cropped that way. Yep, so can you see that? So if we go from off, 1.3 times just squeezes it that way, and then 2 times squeezes it even more that way and expands it actually that way very slightly. Now the reason for this is because most 2 times anamorphic lenses are designed for 35mm film or a sensor the same size as 35mm film, and that isn't as wide as a full frame 6K sensor. So to use this camera in anamorphic with a 2 times anamorphic lens, you need to shoot with full frame 6K to get the correct sensor height, but because then the sensor is wider than 35mm film, with that 2 times anamorphic lens you will get some vignetting around the side. But that's taken into account with the new monitoring system on the LCD screen, and that's why the image is expanded very slightly to remove those edges. Now you don't need to worry about that in terms of image quality, because we're starting with a sensor with 6K of pixels, downsampling that to 4K, and when we do our crop, and even though we have to crop the sides off a little bit and then we squash the image down, the resolution that you end up with is still as high as or even higher than some of the most commonly used anamorphic cameras on the market today. So this is not something you need to be concerned about. And just to stress, the camera doesn't ever output a squashed or squeezed image. It will always output that full height image, which is what you want, because you want to then take it into post-production and do all of your adjustments in post-production. And it's completely suitable for either 4x3 or 6x5 lenses. It really doesn't matter. You'll make those fine tuning, those fine adjustments for the particular lens that you're using in post. So again, this is a really nice mode, really nice update for the camera, and I love shooting anamorphic, so I'm really looking forward to doing more anamorphic shooting with the FX9. So what else do we have? Let's come out of here and go back. So many of you will be familiar with the fact that if I press the status button on the camera, we get these menu pages, and those of you that know the camera better will actually perhaps notice that at the moment there's only 9 of these pages where normally there are 12. Because one of the things that we can do now, if we go into the main menu and we go down to technical and we scroll down, we have a status page on and off option. So we can now turn on and off some of the status pages that perhaps you don't use very often, like the GPS one. So that just makes it a little bit quicker, a little bit more efficient when you're scrolling through the status pages. So now you only see the pages that you use regularly, and it's entirely up to you which ones you choose to have on or which ones that you choose to have off. Now, while I'm in the menu, I'm going to keep going in the menu settings because there's another change in here. And if I go up to timecode and media and we go to clip name format, we have a new clip naming format. So previously we had this one, title, and that allowed you to set a prefix for the clip, and then you have your clip number. Now what we have now is this new mode, which is camera ID and reel number, and this is actually very similar to the way Venice and most other cinema cameras work, in that we can set a ID letter for the camera through A to Z. I have to remember to say Z for Canada and not Z, so A to Z. And then we have a reel number, so this is the first card in the camera, so this is numbered number 1. And then we have a camera position setting, and this can be C, L or R, which is center, left and right. So that tells you where the camera was. And now if I come out of the menu, if we look at the clip numbering there, it says A because this is camera A, 001 because this is roll number 1, then we have C because it's the center camera, and this is clip number 4. And each time I press record, that clip number will increment and increase. Now the reel number doesn't increment automatically, you have to do that yourself, but at least now you can increment your reel number and the clip numbers will then continue to sequentially count up. They don't go back to 0 each time, and that gives you a really nice way of numbering your reels, your clips, knowing which camera it was and knowing which camera position it was. And this is very similar to the way most cinema cameras name their clips. So something else that we have now is real-time proxy uploading. So previously you had to shoot what you wanted to shoot, and then you could use the camera to upload proxies to a server, and that server might be connected to an edit suite for a very quick turnaround edit. Now the proxies can be uploaded while you're shooting, and in fact you don't have to wait now until you've finished rolling. The camera will upload the proxies while you're getting on with your job. And that means for a very fast turnaround news story perhaps, the editor can actually be editing your material while you're still shooting it. So we now have a real-time upload of proxy files, and that is a really nice function. Now, how do we get those proxy files from the camera to the studio? Well, that has now also become much simpler, because the XDCA FX9 here has always had 2 USB connectors on the back, but that was for use with a USB data modem. So you would plug in your USB 4G or 5G LTE dongle into the XDCA and use that for your internet connection. But now we can tether to a mobile phone. If I go into the menus and I go down to my network connections. So the first thing I need to do is to turn off my Ethernet connection, and let's just let that switch off. And once the Ethernet connection is off, if I now turn on the modem setting here, I get a message now has popped up on my mobile phone here. This is a Sony Xperia Pro, and it says USB connectivity. So if I go into the phone, let's just unlock the phone, it says the connected device will be able to access the data on your phone if allowed. So we just click allow, and now the camera can use my phone here as a 5G connection to upload those proxy files or to stream live if you're using the QoS streaming. So you don't need to have a separate dongle to do that. And the Xperia Pro that I have here is a really nice phone to use for these sorts of applications because it has a very good 5G connection, but also it has an HDMI input here, and I could use it as an external monitor as well. So it could act as both monitor and my data connection to the rest of the world. So a really nice little setup to have. There is now metadata for when you are shooting in HDR and you want to deliver both an SDR image and an HDR image. So we're now in the HDR mode. Now again, this is another one of those features that only works for the LCD screen. But what it does is it adds an offset to the LCD so that when you're shooting in HDR, you can view what this picture would look like in SDR with an SR Live HDR workflow. You can see that you can have a gain offset added to the viewfinder. So when we have a lower gain offset, it makes that SDR preview dark, and that then makes you expose a bit brighter. So then you have a really good SDR image for SDR viewers. And then that metadata that there is a -6 dB offset to be applied passes along your production chain. The 6 dB offset is applied so that then both the HDR and the SDR look great. And that's how this workflow works. It's quite complicated. I'm not sure how many people this is important for, but it does make producing both SDR and HDR at the same time much simpler, especially in live applications. So I hope you found this little video useful. There is an awful lot in the version 3 firmware update for the FX9 coming to the camera. For me personally, the touch to focus and touch tracking AF is really, really nice, and I think that's a feature that I'm going to be using almost every time I use the camera. Anamorphic is also very nice. Being able to monitor correctly in anamorphic is going to make shooting anamorphic really easy with the FX9. So do enjoy the rest of the virtual show, and thank you for watching.